Hi, folks. It's time to talk a little bit about globalization, culture, and cities. In this video today, we are going to do a couple of different things. Talk a little bit about urbanization in general, and then also talk about, there's another couple of videos in addition to this video lecture on cities in China. And so, without further ado, we're just going to launch into it. So, one of the reasons why we like to study cities is that a lot of the problems, well, first of all, most of humanity now lives in cities, and this is actually different. Today, about 54% of all people live in cities, and by the year 2050, the estimate is that it'll be about 70% of the human population will be in cities. And this is quite different if you look at the percentage of urban population in the world, even in 1950, was only about 30%. And so what this means is that the problems we run into because we have lots of people in really big cities are new problems, right? This is not something that, this is not the way humans have been sort of living their lives on the planet most of our existence. And so the things that we're looking at now with how to handle kind of urban problems are actually somewhat new problems. And so if we actually look then at this growth in context, in 1800, only 3% of the world's population lived in cities. And there were only 13 cities in the whole world that had a population of 1 million people in 1900. Now, as I've mentioned, more than half of us live there, and there are almost 450 cities. Actually, this is old data, so now there are over 450 cities with 1 million or more people in it. There are cities that you have never heard of that have 1 million people, and so this is, like I said, a kind of a new thing. Now, before we kind of get too far into thinking about how urbanized this world is, it's important to recognize the U.S. Census definition of what counts as urban. The U.S. Census definition is that any area that has 2,500 or more inhabitants counts as urban, which means Keene would be counted as an urban area. And so the threshold for how many people you need to be considered urban is not terribly high, right? Because there's some pretty small towns that are 2,500 people. But again, but in the United States, I should add too, much more than half of our population is in these urban areas that are at least 2,500 inhabitants. And so if you look at the percentage of population that is considered to be urban, you can see here in the US between 80 and 100. We're in that top echelon of urbanization, but again, the city size isn't all that big to count as urban. And you can see other heavily urbanized places like Australia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, France, Norway, Finland, Japan, these sort of areas. The places that still have a fairly small percentage of their population in cities are relatively undeveloped countries, places like Cambodia, Papua New Guinea, Ethiopia, etc. So in terms of how cities came to be, there's a couple of things that you need in order to even have cities. And there are really two elements. And if we go way back in history in terms of how cities kind of started, the first thing you need is an agricultural surplus. And what I mean by that is people have to have some sort of system. Well, first of all, cities aren't possible if you're just gathering food, right? Because if you're just going out and hunting and gathering what already exists, you can't really put a very large concentration of people anywhere if you're doing that. Once you start agriculture, which for humans, we'll talk about this a little bit next week, starts between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago in various places around the world. Once you can plant crops and produce more food per person than, the person planting it can grow food for more than just themselves, you get an agricultural surplus, and then you also get a stratified social system. And what this means is you start getting more of a division of labor. You have people doing different functions in that city. So some people are growing the food, some people are the soldiers, some people are the administrators, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not possible until you get to the point where somebody's making more food than just being able to feed themselves, that they can also produce food for people doing these other tasks. And so when we look at sort of the origin of cities, a lot of them are in these areas of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Of course, there are also cities that developed in the New World as well. But you can see kind of how, about 3,000 BC, and so about 5,000 years ago that we first start getting some true cities. And you'll notice the places where these are areas that have a lot of sunlight, a lot of, sunny skies, but next to rivers. And so you can irrigate crops, and you have relatively mild climates. And so you can grow a lot of food if you irrigate them. And so that's not a surprise that some of the places these first cities show up are in river valleys in relatively warm areas. And then the idea of the city spreads, it diffuses. And so, for instance, you get cities that developed in the Fertile Crescent area, but that idea sort of then spreads. The idea that, along with agriculture, that you can kind of concentrate people in certain ways. And then you also get certain designs of cities. So, for instance, Islamic cities kind of spread out with the spread of Islam across Saudi Arabia, across the Indian Ocean, and across North Africa. The way the the Greeks and then the Romans built their cities kind of informs how the Europeans built their cities. And then when they came to other areas like Latin America or Australia, they take that way of making a city and implanting it in those areas. And same with Chinese cities, kind of diffused into different areas. And so there are different styles of cities that have diffused from these cultural hearths. So in terms of kind of the origin of cities, talk about kind of the first and the second urban revolutions. The first urban revolution is what I was just talking about in terms of the connection with agricultural innovations. All of a sudden you can feed more people and you can start having cities. Is really the first urban revolution, when people first start making cities. The second urban revolution arises in places, particularly Western Europe, North America, with industrialization. So if you recall, when we talked about economics, we talked about enclosure and the driving of people sort of out of the rural landscapes in England and in other parts of Europe. And those people then went into the cities. One of the ways in which those people could be fed is, first of all, you had agricultural production still going on with more of a wage labor kind of economic production. And you had these factories in the cities and these big transportation systems to be able to move lots of food into these industrial centers. And so that was really kind of the second burst of urbanization in the world. And along with this, with this time period is also when kind of the origins of capitalism as a way of organizing the economies. It introduced the idea that land is a commodity, right? Something that can be bought and sold. And this also becomes a source of income. And one of the things that you end up with in these urban areas during the second urban revolution is residential areas becoming segregated by economic class, wealthy parts of town versus poor parts of town, that sort of thing. And as we saw in our section when we talked about race and ethnicity in the United States, you also get these other patterns of segregation in the cities as they grow in terms of race and other things like that. But one of the things that we take for granted about our cities, but it's actually something that was somewhat new when these second urban revolution cities were developing, is that the place of work became spatially distinct from home. So if you think about it, back in agricultural times or even early industrial times when they had what were called cottage industries, this is when, let's say, somebody was making, wool, for clothing. You had people that might have sheep. They take it, they, raise the sheep, they shear them, they work the wool and maybe, knit it into things, into, clothing. And you may do this all within your home. So where you're working and where you're living is the same place. With the advent of factories and having your energy source, whether that be kind of water powered or later steam powered, and you have a factory somewhere where people came to go do work to take, say, the wool, the threads, and then to turn it into textiles and that sort of thing. Then all of a sudden you had these very different structures to your city because you had a place of employment and then you had someplace that you lived, and they were no longer the same place. And so you also then needed the transportation systems and everything else that kind of develop in these cities. And then, when we talk about why cities arose where they did, like why are the really big cities in the eastern United States, places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, they tend to be like on the coast or on a river, where a river comes to the ocean. And there's a few different reasons why cities are where they are. And part of it, especially early on, is that early cities tended to be located in places that were easily defended. Islands, hilltops, sheltered harbors, bends in rivers, that sort of thing. Whereas in the industrial age, you started getting other reasons why cities would be placed somewhere. Are you close to raw materials? Things such as coal, woods, metal, that sort of thing. So An early city might look something like this, right? A classic sort of defensive type city. This is Mont Saint-Michel in France, where at high tide, the water used to, they kind of built a causeway and stuff, but originally at high tide, you couldn't even get into the city. You could only approach it at low tide. And so it was very easily defended. But the industrial city would be something like Pittsburgh. And the reason why Pittsburgh developed where it was is it was on some major rivers where the Ohio River, where the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River come together and create the Ohio River that keeps going down and connects to the Mississippi. So you could move things back and forth on this big river system all the way through the Mississippi River and all of that. But also Pittsburgh is near coal that you needed for the steel industry, and you could get iron ore there from the Great Lakes area relatively easily. And so it was a good place to put everything together. And that's why the city sort of is where it is its relationships to raw materials, much more than defense. Although it's also somewhat defensible because you've got this sort of peninsula area here too. Okay. That's sort of the theories of why cities are where they are in terms of industrial era and all of that. Early era when it's about defense, industrial era when it's about being near your raw materials. But then there's another theory about why cities are where they are, and this is called central place theory. And it was put forward by a guy named Christaller, and he essentially thought of cities not so much for what they produced, but as places where you sell stuff. So as kind of economic centers of consumption. And the idea is that you're going to have different sized cities sort of spread out around, in a particular area based on how far people will go for certain services. And essentially his model looks like this. It looks like hexagons, and I'll explain this here. The argument is that you might have a really, really big city, say in the middle of this area, and you're going to get some smaller cities around that. And then you might have some what are called second order, you might have some second order places kind of surrounding at a certain distance from that major city to supply people in those areas with goods that they're not willing to go all the way out here for. But then there are certain other size cities you're going to get, like here you have third order cities and fourth order cities. And so it's kind of like first order being the biggest and second order, et cetera. Let me put this into context here. For New England, our first order place is Boston, right? That's definitely the biggest city in the area. And then we have some other cities that are relatively large that are around, places like maybe New Haven and Hartford and Portland, Maine, and Manchester, right, New Hampshire, those sort of things. And so we could think of those as sort of the second order cities, and they're kind of spaced out from each other. And then you have other cities that are kind of third order that are around places like maybe Springfield, in Massachusetts, and Worcester, and maybe Concord, right, these sort of things. And then you have cities like Keene, kind of our size city. And they're kind of spread out around the map in a way that they're kind of, you don't have them generally like right next to each other. And the reason why is that this is kind of a more simplistic version, right? Big city, you might have some little villages, and then as you start getting further away, these larger towns are there that have their own villages around them. And the reason why cities tend to arrange themselves like this is because of two factors. This is Christaller's argument: threshold and range. Threshold is the size of the population that you need to have to make the provision of something economically feasible. So for instance, there are certain things that you can't have in your city unless your city is big enough. So why does Keene not have a NFL team? Well, there's not enough people here for that. Is Boston big enough for an NFL team? Yes, and that's why they have the Patriots. So that means, like for instance, if we go back to this, if we all want to go see a football game, we might drive 2 hours to go into Foxborough near Boston to go see a football game. But there's just not enough people out here to have that same function, or an international airport. There's a reason you can't fly to Europe from Keene. There's just not enough people here that do it. But we're willing to drive to Boston to take an international flight to then go somewhere. And so those functions, things like international flights, maybe also concerts and professional sports, et cetera, are all going to be in that big city because the other cities just aren't big enough to really support it. And this leads to that second question, range. There's a maximum distance people will travel to purchase a good or service. There's a certain distance where, like in theory, we could all fly out of New York City and fly internationally instead of out of Boston. But that's starting to get a little far to I don't really want to drive 5 hours to go to an airport and then fly. Like if I can go to Boston in 2 hours, there's some limits here. And so because of that, you're going to get these sort of, these international airports somewhat spaced out. But then there are other things that, for instance, I won't drive to Boston for. Like I'm not going to drive to Boston to go to the grocery store. So that means grocery stores have to be in some of these smaller second order and third order towns. So for instance, a place like Keene have 4 or 5 big grocery stores. But if you go to a place like, say, Walpole or Troy, some of the smaller towns around, there's not enough people to support a whole giant grocery store. And that's why they're in these slightly larger cities. Because if let's say hypothetically you lived in Walpole, yeah, you'll drive to Keene to go to the grocery store. But you wouldn't drive to Boston, right? So you need to have these things kind of more spaced out and spread out. And we have enough population to support a number of grocery stores, right? And so that's how threshold and range kind of fit together to get this pattern of how far would you be willing to go for something, but also how many people do you have to support that business. And so this has become, in a sense, more important since a lot of what we do isn't necessarily manufacturing. We don't have to be near our raw materials, all this stuff. A lot of times now cities are kind of the sizes they are and placed where they are in terms of this distance to markets or the distance is to goods that we want to consume. Okay. Another thing about cities, that's another important point for this section, is that we have to look at the economic base of a city and how a city can exist. Because one of the things about cities is that if you don't have something bringing income into that city from outside, it's hard for a city to function, right? So for instance, in Keene, well, let me back up a second. The way we think about this is through these two terms that I have on this slide, basic sector and non-basic sector. These are types of kind of economic activities. A basic sector employer or a basic sector sort of institution is something that brings money in from outside the community. So for instance, in Keene, we have a few basic sector types of jobs here. Keene State is one of them, right? Keene State brings money from outside into the community. So for instance, students come from all over the place. They come here, they spend their tuition money, and that is money that then goes into the economy. Trying to think of other examples. Sometimes shopping here in Keene can be because for especially certain types of items, because New Hampshire doesn't have a sales tax, some people may travel in from Massachusetts or Vermont and then spend money here to buy things because we don't have sales tax. That would be another example of money coming into the community. Non-basic sector jobs are ones that just essentially supply residents with goods and services. So for instance, a pizza place here or lab and lager, this sort of thing. Those places will service the people that are already here. So they don't necessarily bring money into the community. Mostly they circulate the money around, or like a dentist's office here in town. People may not come from really far away to come to the dentist here. Instead, it serves the people that are here. So the basic industries are really important because they bring money in. And then for every person that has a job in that basic sector, they then go out and spend money at the pizza place or the bar or the dentist or the whatever, and that supports these other jobs. So the total economic structure of an area equals the basic and the non-basic jobs and activities. And one of the key points about this, or why this is important to understand, is that there's something called the multiplier effect, which is that for every basic sector job you add, you actually typically add about 2 non-basic sector jobs. So for instance, if Keene State hires 10 more professors. And let's say more students come. We need effective demand, if you remember the effective demand, right? We need people who are students coming here to teach or to learn, and then we say hire 10 more faculty to do that. Now you've added these 10 jobs, and each one of those people is going to go get pizza and go to the dentist and go to the bars and et cetera, go to the grocery stores. And that's going to create not just 10 more jobs, but actually will create another 20 jobs for the fact that those people are, that these people came. So it says here, city adds basic sector employment. It acquires people filling non-basic sector positions at a faster rate. But it's also true the opposite direction. If we cut 10 faculty members and people get or staff members and the employment here at Keene State gets smaller, you don't just lose 10 jobs in the community, you lose another 20 in the non-basic sector, because for every person who's now not going out and buying things at the bar, at the pizza place, and the dentist, now there's fewer people spending that other money, and so those sectors contract even more. And that's why cities are always on the lookout to try and keep the basic sector jobs they have and to get more of them. But when we think about this in terms of population, too, for cities, it's even the effect is even greater. Because let's say that for every job, that basic sector job, that those people are bringing in a whole family, right? And let's just say that for each worker that's getting a new job somewhere, that they represent a family of 3 people, right? So this would mean, let's say, if you had 10 new jobs here at Keene State, staff and faculty, and let's say that each of them it was a family size of 3. Well, you'd have the 10 basic sector jobs. They'd also create 20 non-basic sector jobs. And if every one of those new jobs, now you have 30 jobs, had a family of 3, it means you actually have increased your population by 90 people by adding 10 basic sector jobs. And then also, again, if you lose 10 basic sector jobs, you could end up losing 90 people if all of those people then go elsewhere for work. And so it has this really big kind of multiplier effect both on employment, but also on population. All right, so kind of switching gears here, getting us set up for the videos that come after this on China and urbanization in China. One of the things I should mention is that right now, one of the largest migrations in human history is going on, and that is the migration of people from rural China to urban China. It is a huge program of urbanization that's been going on in China now for several decades, and is going to continue into the future. It's a massive project of urbanization. But China is not the only place that's been undergoing this, of course. We get these things that we refer to as megacities, which are cities that are over 10 million people. But one of the things about some of these megacities that exist around the world, places like Delhi, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, is that they usually have a lot of massive sort of income inequality. Unemployment rates, like around these megacities in the developing world, among people that first come into the city, can be over 50%. Housing and infrastructure frequently can't be built fast enough. Water and sewage systems are not designed to handle such a massive influx of people. And so sometimes cities can be in a lot of trouble because they are growing so fast. And if we look at some of the largest sort of mega cities, and keep in mind, everything on this map is huge, right? The smallest ones here are 10 million people. So places like Lima and Peru, but then also, New York City would count as sort of a mega city, Los Angeles area, Paris, Moscow, but also places like Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Manila, Jakarta, etc. Japan, Tokyo, Yokohama area, etc. Shanghai, Beijing. So you have these different large mega cities that have been growing up, or as they call them here, megalopoli, which I think is an awesome word. Another kind of point about cities is that in some countries, they have one city that is kind of the most important city by far in the country. And when they have that, we call it urban primacy, or it's also sometimes called a primate city. A primate city is not a city with a bunch of lemurs or other kinds of primates. Well, I guess there are a lot of primates because we're primates. So anyway, But what they mean by Primate City here is that that there's one city so much larger than everything else, and it's the seat of government, it's the seat of the economy, it's the kind of the cultural center of the country. So London would be a primate city for the United Kingdom. Paris is a primate city for France. Buenos Aires is a primate city. Tokyo is a primate city. Does the United States have a primate city? Not really. New York City, sort of, but that's like not where the government is, right? That's in Washington, D.C. You could argue that entertainment and culture really comes out of, say, well, New York, but also Los Angeles. And then we have Chicago, which is also pretty big. And so the United States, usually people think of as not necessarily having a primate city, but many countries do. Another way of thinking about large cities around the world is sometimes referred to as global cities. It's not just about their size, but it's about where transnational companies are and like the cities that are really connected to the global economy. So where there's a lot of the big banks or corporate headquarters, that sort of thing. And a large part of global cities are in Europe still, but again, it says here the list used the following factors to determine the global status. Was there a lot of business activity, expertise in terms of different types of, like banking and finance, information exchange, political engagement, cultural experiences, etc. And you can see that in terms of these kind of global cities, places that aren't super huge, but like Singapore, Rome, Zurich, Madrid, Buenos Aires, these sort of things are kind of in these top lists of cities that kind of run where the global economy is kind of being run out of. And as noted, in these large cities, you do get a lot of inequality. On one hand, these global cities are places with where like the really super rich tend to congregate. Sometimes it's referred to as like the global cosmopolitan class, the wealthy that can kind of travel back and forth all over the place, from usually rich city to rich city, and have gated communities or secure high-rise buildings, that sort of thing. And if you look at where the super rich all are, you can see in terms of the number of high net worth individuals, people that have more than $30 million in assets, you can see they're concentrated in places like New York, London, Tokyo, right? These world cities. And another important point that is going on in many cities is what's called gentrification. Gentrification is when an area of a city that had been sort of a poor area changes because richer people move into it. So it's the displacement of lower income residents by higher income residents. And there's that happens usually when people either build some new big project, like the way the Baltimore waterfront was redone, or the Staples Center in the middle of Los Angeles. These kinds of things, a lot of times then the poor people that had lived there sort of get forced out by higher prices, higher rentals, etc. But while these cities may be places where a lot of the rich are congregating, they also tend to be places where a lot of the poor are congregating. And particularly in developing countries, you get these areas around cities which we refer to as shanty towns, or sometimes they go by other terms as well. But usually a shanty town is sort of a precarious settlement where people may not own the land, they're kind of squatting on it, and putting up housing, usually not to great building standards. They may not have water systems, sewage systems, these sort of things. And these shanty towns, also called slums, over 1 billion people in the world live in these shanty towns. And it says here, they usually begin as a collection of crude shacks constructed from scrap materials, etc., and then kind of become more complex. And sometimes, eventually, city services will reach out to these slums and shanty towns, but they're very risky and vulnerable places because, if there's floods or earthquakes or that sort of thing, the substandard building materials are really susceptible to disaster, and are also fires because there may not be water mains and adequate fire service and that sort of thing. And so life in these shanty towns can be quite precarious, and about 1 out of every 7 people in the world live in them. And then kind of the last section here I want to touch on is that cities have particular environmental vulnerabilities. One of the things about cities is that, if you see a city, it means that you're packing a whole lot of people into a small space. And that has some environmental consequences and also some risks for the people that live in urban areas. So, this is just an example of sort of an area of that's being, urbanized, and then people are moving in. And one of the things that kind of happens, I've already kind of talked about this, right, is that when you pack a lot of people into a small area, they become at risk for any kind of large hazardous event that might occur in that area, whether it's a flood or a hurricane or fires and this sort of thing. Because there's dense concentrations of people, disasters are more destructive. Even though it may be the same earth process, right? Hurricanes have been going on for a long time, so have earthquakes, but people are in more and more vulnerable positions because of the density. And obviously with things like, with climate change, increasing some of these hazards and risks, it poses a pretty big threat to people living in different urban areas. But also, not only is the environment potentially more threatening to people that have congregated into urban areas also change the environment itself in a couple of very important ways. One of them is what's referred to as the urban heat island. Urban areas are hotter than the surrounding countryside because the pavement and building and other man-made structures tend to absorb heat differently than open landscape. So for instance, and it can be quite a dramatic effect actually. And so for instance, if you look at what an urban center, what's going on in terms of the temperatures, particularly at night, because a lot of times the heat from the sun during the day gets held in the pavement and then kind of re-radiated out. The temperature in the middle of a city center can be as much as 20 degrees higher as it is in the surrounding areas. We actually have a little bit of this effect even in a town like Keene. One of the geography senior projects a couple years ago was looking at the heat island even here. It exists, but in big cities like Denver, Phoenix, San Antonio, these sort of areas, Atlanta, you get this really huge effect of a much higher temperatures in these areas that are built up. Another thing that happens is that if you build all these urban structures like parking lots and roads and the roofs of houses, rain that would fall that used to seep into the ground no longer can. It hits these hard surfaces and runs off. And what this means is that you vastly increase the possibility of flooding in that area and also for areas downstream of where you urbanize. And so this can actually create a much bigger flood risk than there had been in that particular area. And this is such a big problem that many, many towns, Keene included, spent a lot of time trying to figure out, trying to manage urbanization. Like it's one of the reasons why there are restrictions on building like other homes, on your property, or, putting a lot more pavement down, because if people do that on all of their properties, it can, if everybody put down twice as much concrete, on their properties, you'd have a whole lot more runoff, and then you all of a sudden have floods that can overwhelm the storm drains and the whole systems and create massive flooding. And that actually happens here in this town and happens in many others as well. And sometimes it's not something people think about much when they think about urbanization, but it creates quite a bit bigger flood risk. So because of that, there is actually a really big emphasis these days on making cities resilient. In other words, making cities that can withstand these changing and risky kind of environmental hazards. And so some cities are much better at kind of putting in these resilience programs. Places like Keene are actually pretty good. They have people here on the city staff that work on resilience of the community. But also in places like Latin America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they hire a lot of people to try and make cities more environmentally resilient, particularly in the context of climate change. And he says here, here in red, resilience involves the ability to better predict future trends rather than looking backward to how things used to be. It's kind of recognizing, well, environmental change has happened or is happening, and our risks are greater. And so how do we kind of handle that? And resilience just means like essentially the ability to withstand hazards or potential dangers and still kind of function the way you want to function. And again, places like Latin America, Canada, etc., are much bigger into doing this kind of resilience planning. The United States lags pretty far behind, actually. And a lot of that is probably some of the political situation here in the US, where it's hard to hire people to work on making cities resilient to climate change if there's a large movement of people within the country that don't believe climate change exists. It's hard to sometimes get those sort of programs up and running, whereas that's not really an issue in most other parts of the world. Okay, that's it for this lecture video. Don't forget that to watch those 2 short videos on urbanization in China. And for this particular semester in this section, we're not meeting this week, so this is it. Oh, well, we are on Monday, right? We don't have class at all on Wednesday because it's a holiday for Veterans Day. But for Monday, whether you usually come to Wednesday class or Monday class, you're very welcome to come to class. We're going to go try and just find something fun to do. If the weather's nice, we'll go out and do something. If the weather's not so nice, we'll find something fun to do here. So anyway, that's the plan for the week. And I will see you all, hopefully some of you on Monday and the rest of you on another time.